What I'm about to tell you will shake you to your core, but it needs to be said because almost nobody is prepared for what's coming. The financial crisis heading our way in 2026 will make 2008 look like a minor market correction. We're not just facing another recession or market crash. We're facing what I call the Great Reset 2.0, a complete restructuring of the global economic system that will destroy the wealth of unprepared investors and transfer it to those who see it coming. I lived through 2008. I watched trillion-dollar companies disappear overnight. I saw real estate values collapse by 50%. I witnessed unemployment skyrocket and retirement accounts get cut in half. But what's building now is exponentially more dangerous because the underlying problems that caused 2008 were never actually solved. They were just papered over with money printing and government debt that have created even bigger bubbles and more systemic risk. In 2008, we had a housing bubble and banking crisis. In 2026, we're going to have simultaneous bubbles in housing, stocks, bonds, government debt, corporate debt, and currencies all collapsing at the same time. The interconnectedness of global markets and the scale of leverage in the system means that when this crisis hits, there will be nowhere to hide and no assets that remain unaffected. The people who understand what's coming and position themselves correctly will emerge from this crisis wealthier and more powerful than ever. The people who ignore the warning signs and continue believing that governments and central banks can prevent economic reality forever will lose everything they've worked their entire lives to build. If you want to understand how to not just survive, but thrive during the Great Reset 2.0, you need to subscribe to this channel right now and pay attention to every word I'm about to share, because the information I'm going to reveal could be the difference between financial independence and complete financial destruction. Let me start by explaining why 2026 will be fundamentally different and more devastating than 2008. In 2008, the crisis was primarily contained to the financial sector and real estate markets. Most people still had jobs, governments had fiscal capacity to respond, and central banks had tools like interest rate cuts that could stimulate recovery. Today, every sector of the economy is over-leveraged and vulnerable to crisis. Government debt levels are unsustainable. Central banks have already used all their conventional tools and are trapped by inflation. The demographic and technological changes reshaping the economy are permanent, not cyclical. When this crisis hits, there won't be any healthy sectors to drive recovery. The first factor that makes 2026 worse than 2008 is the scale of debt throughout the entire system. In 2008, total U.S. debt was approximately $40 trillion. Today, it's approaching $90 trillion. Corporate debt, government debt, consumer debt, all at levels that were unimaginable before the previous crisis. This debt creates systemic fragility where small shocks can trigger massive collapses. But it's not just the amount of debt, it's the quality and structure of that debt. Much of today's debt was issued when interest rates were near zero, meaning borrowers took on obligations they can't service at current interest rates. As this debt rolls over or gets refinanced, borrowers face payment increases that many cannot afford, triggering defaults and bankruptcies across the economy. The second factor is currency debasement and inflation that didn't exist during the 2008 crisis. In 2008, deflation was the primary concern, which gave central banks the flexibility to print money and cut interest rates to zero. Today, inflation is the constraint that prevents central banks from responding aggressively to financial crisis without making the inflation problem worse. This creates an impossible choice for policymakers. If they respond to financial crisis with money printing and rate cuts, they'll reignite inflation that destroys purchasing power for everyone. If they maintain tight monetary policy to fight inflation, they'll accelerate financial crisis and economic collapse. Either choice leads to devastating outcomes for different groups of people. The third factor is technological displacement that's eliminating jobs and entire industries at unprecedented speed. In 2008, technological unemployment was a future concern. Today, artificial intelligence, robotics, and automation are destroying middle-class jobs faster than new ones are being created. This creates structural unemployment that can't be solved with traditional economic stimulus. When large numbers of people lose their jobs permanently rather than temporarily, they can't service their debts or maintain their consumption levels. This creates a deflationary spiral where reduced spending leads to more business failures and job losses, which further reduces spending in an accelerating downward cycle that becomes impossible to stop. The fourth factor is demographic collapse in developed countries that's reducing the number of workers relative to retirees. In 2008, demographics were still favorable, with large working-age populations supporting smaller numbers of retirees. Today, baby boomers are retiring en masse while birth rates have collapsed, creating massive unfunded liabilities for pensions and health care. This demographic inversion means that governments face exponentially increasing spending obligations at exactly the time when their tax base is shrinking. The mathematics of this situation are unsolvable without either massive tax increases that destroy economic growth or money printing that destroys currency value. The fifth factor is geopolitical instability and the breakdown of international cooperation that provided stability during previous crises. In 2008, major countries worked together to coordinate responses and prevent the crisis from spreading. Today, we have trade wars, sanctions, military conflicts, and breakdown of international institutions that made previous cooperation possible. When the next crisis hits, countries will pursue beggar-thy-neighbor policies that make the global situation worse while trying to protect their domestic interests. Currency wars, trade restrictions, and financial warfare will amplify the crisis rather than containing it, creating a destructive feedback loop that prevents recovery. The sixth factor is the complete financialization of the economy that makes it vulnerable to asset price collapses. In 2008, most people's wealth was in their homes and traditional savings accounts. Today, everyone's retirement depends on stock market performance, real estate values, and bond prices. When these asset bubbles collapse simultaneously, they'll destroy the wealth of an entire generation. The concentration of wealth in financial assets means that asset price declines have much broader economic effects than they did in previous crises. When stock markets fall, it doesn't just affect wealthy investors anymore. It affects teachers, firefighters, nurses, and everyone else whose retirement accounts are invested in those markets. The seventh factor is the complete dependence on complex financial systems that can fail catastrophically when stressed. In 2008, the financial system was complicated but still manageable. Today we have algorithmic trading, derivatives markets larger than global GDP, and interconnected systems so complex that nobody fully understands how they work or what happens when they break down. High-frequency trading, automated market making, and algorithmic risk management create the possibility for flash crashes and cascading failures that happen faster than humans can respond. When markets become unstable, these systems can amplify volatility and create crashes that would be impossible in traditional markets. Now let me explain how these 7 factors combine to create a perfect storm that will reshape the global economy permanently. This isn't just another cyclical downturn that economies recover from in a few years. This is a structural breakdown of the economic system that has dominated the world for the past 50 years, forcing a complete reset of how money, wealth, and power operate. The Great Reset 2.0 will unfold in 3 phases, each more devastating than anything we experienced in 2008. Phase 1 is the trigger phase, where one or more of the bubbles I described begins to collapse and spreads contagion throughout interconnected markets. Phase 2 is the cascade phase, where multiple systems fail simultaneously as the crisis overwhelms all attempts at containment. Phase 3 is the reset phase, where new economic structures emerge from the wreckage of the old system. We're currently in the pre-trigger phase, where warning signs are visible to those who know what to look for, but most people remain oblivious to the building dangers. Yield curve inversions, bank failures, commercial real estate collapses, currency instabilities, all the indicators that preceded previous crises are flashing red simultaneously. But unlike 2008, where the trigger was obvious in retrospect, The 2026 crisis could be triggered by any number of interconnected vulnerabilities: a major bank failure, a sovereign debt crisis, a currency collapse, a derivatives market breakdown, a geopolitical shock, or simply the recognition that asset prices have become completely disconnected from economic reality. The trigger doesn't matter because the underlying instabilities ensure that any significant shock will cascade throughout the system. When everything is over-leveraged and interconnected, small problems become big problems very quickly. The question isn't what will trigger the crisis, but how long the system can maintain its current unstable equilibrium. Phase 1 will begin when forced selling in one major market creates liquidity problems that spread to other markets. In 2008, this happened primarily in mortgage markets before spreading to banking and then to the broader economy. In 2026, it could start anywhere because every major market is vulnerable to sudden liquidity crises. Commercial real estate is already showing severe stress with massive value declines and refinancing problems. Regional banks heavily exposed to commercial real estate could face the same type of collapse that hit savings and loan associations in the 1980s, but with much broader systemic effects because of greater interconnectedness. Corporate debt markets could trigger the crisis as companies that borrowed heavily when rates were low face refinancing at much higher costs. Many companies that appeared financially stable when interest rates were near zero become insolvent when they must refinance at current market rates, creating a wave of bankruptcies that destroys jobs and economic activity. Government bond markets present perhaps the greatest systemic risk because they're the foundation of the entire financial system. When investors lose confidence in government's ability to service their debts without destroying their currencies, bond markets collapse and take everything else down with them. This scenario becomes more likely every day as debt levels continue growing faster than economic output. Phase 2 begins when the crisis spreads beyond financial markets into the real economy through bank failures, credit contraction, and mass unemployment. This is when the 2026 crisis becomes clearly worse than 2008 because the scale of disruption will be much larger and the tools for response will be much more limited. In 2008, governments could increase spending and central banks could cut interest rates to stimulate recovery. In 2026, governments are already running unsustainable deficits and central banks are constrained by inflation. The policy response that ended the 2008 crisis will either be impossible or will create even worse problems than the original crisis. Bank failures will be larger and more numerous because banks are bigger, more interconnected, and more exposed to multiple types of risk simultaneously. The failure of one major bank will trigger runs on other banks as depositors lose confidence in the entire system. Government deposit insurance won't be adequate to handle multiple large bank failures simultaneously. Credit contraction will be more severe because lending standards will tighten dramatically as banks face massive losses and regulatory pressure. Businesses that depend on credit to finance operations will face cash flow crises that force layoffs and bankruptcies. Consumers who depend on credit for major purchases will be shut out of markets, causing demand to collapse. Mass unemployment will result not just from business failures, but from permanent technological displacement that makes many jobs obsolete forever. Unlike previous recessions where most jobs eventually returned, the 2026 crisis will accelerate automation and artificial intelligence adoption that eliminates entire categories of employment permanently. The social and political consequences of mass unemployment combined with wealth destruction will create instability that makes economic recovery much more difficult. When large numbers of people lose their jobs, homes, and savings simultaneously, they demand political action that often makes economic problems worse through protectionism, wealth redistribution, and other policies that discourage investment and job creation. Phase 3, the reset phase, is when new economic structures emerge from the collapse of the old system. This is why I call it the Great Reset 2.0, because it will fundamentally change how economies operate, just like the Great Depression led to new economic institutions and policies that dominated for decades. The reset will likely include new monetary systems, possibly based on digital currencies that give governments more control over economic activity. Traditional banking may be replaced by central bank digital currencies that eliminate the need for commercial banks as intermediaries in the payment system. International trade and investment relationships will be restructured as countries pursue economic nationalism and self-sufficiency rather than globalization and specialization. Supply chains will be shortened and domesticated even if this increases costs because security and reliability will be prioritized over efficiency. Social contracts will be rewritten as governments take greater responsibility for economic outcomes through universal basic income, job guarantees, and other programs that increase government control over individual economic choices. The concept of free markets will give way to managed economies where political considerations often override economic efficiency. Property rights and wealth ownership will be redefined through wealth taxes, asset confiscation, and restrictions on capital mobility designed to prevent the concentration of wealth and power that contributed to the crisis. Individual financial privacy and autonomy will be sacrificed for systemic stability and political control. The technology sector will be restructured through antitrust action, regulation, and government ownership of critical digital infrastructure. The power of technology companies to control information, commerce, and social interaction will be constrained in favor of democratic oversight and public accountability. The timeline for this reset depends on how quickly the crisis develops and how effectively existing institutions can manage the transition. If the crisis develops gradually, the reset might unfold over 5 to 10 years, with each phase blending into the next. If the crisis develops rapidly, the entire reset could happen within 2 to 3 years. But regardless of timing, the end result will be an economic system that operates according to completely different principles than the current system. Individual wealth accumulation will be more constrained. Government control over economic activity will be much greater. International economic integration will be reduced in favor of national or regional autarky. Understanding this timeline is crucial for positioning yourself to survive and thrive during the transition. The strategies that work during the trigger and cascade phases are different from the strategies that work during the reset phase. You need to prepare for all three phases if you want to preserve and grow wealth through this historic transition. The people who recognize what's coming and position themselves correctly will emerge from the reset with greater wealth and influence than they had before the crisis. The people who cling to old assumptions and strategies will find themselves impoverished and powerless in the new economic system that emerges from the wreckage. Now let me give you the exact strategy to not just survive the Great Reset 2.0, but to emerge from it wealthier and more powerful than when it began. Because every systemic crisis creates massive wealth transfer opportunities for those who understand what's happening and position themselves correctly before the majority figures it out. The key to thriving during systemic collapse is understanding that different phases require completely different strategies. What protects you during the trigger phase could destroy you during the reset phase if you don't adapt your approach as conditions change. Most people make the fatal mistake of using one strategy throughout the entire crisis and getting crushed when the rules change. For the trigger phase, which we're entering now, your priority must be preserving purchasing power and maintaining liquidity while positioning for opportunities that will emerge during the cascade phase. This means getting out of bubble assets and into crisis-proof stores of value that will maintain their worth when everything else collapses. Physical precious metals are essential for trigger phase protection because they maintain value when currencies and financial assets collapse. But don't just buy gold and silver randomly. Focus on recognized forms like American gold eagles, Canadian gold maple leafs, and silver coins that will be easily tradable during crisis conditions. Store them in secure facilities outside the banking system where they can't be confiscated or frozen. Treasury bills and cash provide liquidity for opportunities, but only in amounts you need for immediate deployment. Large cash positions lose purchasing power to inflation, but you need some cash to take advantage of distressed asset sales when panic selling begins. Keep 6 months of living expenses plus investment capital in secure, accessible forms. Essential business ownership becomes incredibly valuable during systemic crisis because people still need food, energy, healthcare, and other necessities regardless of financial market chaos. Focus on companies that provide essential products and services with pricing power and minimal debt. These businesses often become more valuable during crisis as competitors fail and market share consolidates. For the cascade phase, when the crisis spreads throughout the economy, your strategy shifts to aggressive, opportunistic investing in world-class assets trading at fire sale prices. This is when generational fortunes are made by people who have capital available while everyone else is financially distressed and forced to sell. Real estate will provide extraordinary opportunities during the cascade phase as over-leveraged investors and desperate homeowners are forced to sell properties at fractions of their previous values. But you must be selective about locations and property types. Focus on essential real estate in areas with strong long-term fundamentals, not speculative properties in bubble markets. Dividend aristocrat stocks will become available at valuations not seen in decades as panic selling drives prices down regardless of business quality. Companies like Johnson & Johnson, Coca-Cola, Procter & Gamble, Microsoft, businesses with essential products and strong competitive positions will trade at prices that provide dividend yields of 6, 8, 10% or more. Distressed debt investing becomes extremely profitable during the cascade phase as over-leveraged companies and governments face refinancing crises. Buying the debt of fundamentally strong entities at massive discounts provides both high current income and potential for substantial capital gains when conditions normalize. But the biggest opportunities during cascade phase come from acquiring ownership stakes in essential infrastructure, energy production, food distribution, and other critical economic systems. As existing owners face financial pressure and government bailouts create ownership restructuring, prepared investors can acquire control of assets that will be incredibly valuable during the reset phase. The reset phase requires a completely different strategy, focused on adapting to new economic rules and power structures rather than trying to preserve wealth according to old system principles. This is when political connections and understanding of new regulatory frameworks becomes more important than traditional investment analysis. Central bank digital currencies will likely replace much of the traditional banking system, creating opportunities for early adopters who understand how to operate within digital currency frameworks while maintaining some independence from government monitoring and control. This requires technical knowledge and careful legal structuring that most investors won't develop. Resource ownership becomes critically important during the reset phase as governments prioritize economic security over efficiency and supply chain disruptions become permanent features of the global economy. Ownership of farmland, energy resources, critical minerals, and water rights will provide both income and political influence in the new system. Technology businesses that align with government priorities around surveillance, control, and social management will receive enormous subsidies and regulatory protection. But this requires understanding which technologies will be favored by new political structures and positioning early in emerging companies that serve government needs. International diversification becomes more complex during the reset phase because capital controls and currency restrictions will limit movement of wealth across borders. You need to establish international positions before the crisis accelerates, and these restrictions are implemented, not after. Geographic arbitrage will create opportunities as different countries pursue different reset strategies with varying degrees of success. Some countries will maintain more economic freedom and property rights than others, creating opportunities for people who can relocate capital and operations to more favorable jurisdictions. The psychological preparation for this crisis is as important as the financial preparation because the scale of change will overwhelm most people's ability to adapt. You need to develop mental resilience and decision-making frameworks that will serve you when familiar institutions and relationships break down. Most people will respond to crisis with panic, denial, or paralysis that prevents effective action. The minority who maintain clear thinking and strategic focus will have enormous advantages in acquiring assets from distressed sellers and positioning for opportunities in the new system. Relationship building becomes critical during systemic crisis because traditional institutions lose their reliability and personal networks become the primary sources of information, opportunity, and security. Start building relationships now with people who understand what's coming and have complementary skills and resources. The biggest mistake most people will make during the Great Reset 2.0 is trying to wait it out rather than actively adapting to changing conditions. They'll hold on to assets and strategies that worked in the old system while those assets become worthless and those strategies become counterproductive in the new system. Another fatal mistake will be assuming that government intervention can prevent or reverse the reset process. Political leaders will promise solutions and implement policies designed to maintain the old system, but the mathematical and structural forces driving the reset are too powerful for political intervention to overcome. The most successful people during the reset will be those who recognize early that the old system is ending permanently and begin adapting to the new system before its rules are fully established. They'll position themselves as essential participants in the new economic structures rather than victims of the old system's collapse. Here's what you must do immediately to begin preparing for the Great Reset 2.0. First, conduct a complete audit of your current financial position and identify which assets are vulnerable to systemic collapse versus which provide protection during crisis conditions. Second, begin systematically reducing exposure to bubble assets and financial system dependencies while building positions in crisis-proof stores of value and essential business ownership. This transition must be gradual to avoid triggering tax consequences and market timing mistakes. Third, develop multiple income streams that don't depend on traditional employment or financial market performance. Skills, knowledge, and business ownership that provide value during crisis conditions become your primary sources of security and opportunity. Fourth, establish international relationships and positions before capital controls make this impossible. Banking relationships, business partnerships, and legal structures in favorable jurisdictions provide options when domestic conditions deteriorate. If this analysis has convinced you that the Great Reset 2.0 is inevitable and that positioning yourself correctly could be the most important financial decision of your lifetime, then share this video with everyone who needs this warning. Subscribe to this channel and hit the notification bell because I'll continue providing strategies for navigating this historic transition. Leave a comment below and tell me which phase of the reset you're most concerned about and what steps you're taking to prepare. The community of people who see what's coming needs to support each other through the challenging times ahead. Remember, every great crisis creates great opportunities for those who understand what's happening and have the courage to act on that understanding. The Great Reset 2.0 will destroy the wealth of unprepared masses while creating unprecedented opportunities for the prepared minority. The choice of which group you belong to depends on the decisions you make right now, today, before the crisis accelerates beyond the point where preparation becomes impossible.